sky hung heavy with clouds, a dull gray sheet stretched over Greenwood Cemetery. The air carried a sharp chill, the kind that bit through coats and made every breath visible in ghostly puffs. Leaves, golden and brittle, skittered across the cobblestone paths, swept up and scattered again by the restless autumn breeze. The world seemed hushed here, as though time itself slowed in deference to the silence of the graves. David Reynolds moved along the path with measured steps, his polished shoes clicking faintly against the stones. In his hand, he carried a bouquet of white lilies, Emily's favorite. His grip was firm, but there was no warmth in it. The act had become a ritual, performed not out of devotion, but because it was expected, because he could not think of another way to honor her absence. A year had passed since Emily's death, yet grief clung to him like a second skin. Refusing to loosen its hold at 48, David Reynolds had everything most men only dreamed of. Towers of glass and steel bore his name across Manhattan. His fortune was vast, his influence far-reaching. He was the kind of man whose decisions made stock prices rise or crumble, whose phone call could tilt the outcome of negotiations across continents. But none of that mattered anymore, not in this place. Not with the marble headstone gleaming before him. He paused at the grave, staring down at the words carved in delicate cursive, Emily Reynolds, beloved wife and friend, 1982 to 2023, simple, elegant, just like she had been. David crouched, lowering the lilies to rest against the stone, his reflection faintly mirrored on its polished surface. For a moment, he let his fingertips brush over her name, as though the contact could summon something of her back into the world. But the stone was cold, and the silence pressed in on him, heavier than any deal he had ever carried on his shoulders. It was then he heard a sound carried softly on the wind, a sniffle, broken and human, cutting through the stillness. David lifted his head, frowning slightly. At first he thought it was his imagination, the tricks grief sometimes played when the heart was hollow and desperate. But then he saw her, just a few yards away, kneeling before a nearby grave, was a woman. Her shoulders trembled as though each sob cost her something she did not have to spare. A cascade of dark hair fell forward, partly obscuring her face as she pressed a tissue against her eyes. Something in him stirred. He might have looked away, given her the privacy he himself craved in this place, but he didn't. He couldn't. His gaze clung to her like a man drowning clings to driftwood. The angle of her cheek, the delicate curve of her jaw, the way the breeze lifted a strand of hair across her face. For one terrifying heartbeat, David thought he was looking at Emily. His chest tightened as the world around him seemed to tilt, the cobblestones under his feet giving way to the weight of disbelief. The lilies slipped from his hand, scattering across the grass, their white petals bruising as they landed. His throat closed, breath caught somewhere between memory and madness. This wasn't possible. Emily was gone, buried here in the ground before him. Yet the woman just beyond looked up, and his heart stopped. The same eyes, the same soft mouth, even the small birthmark near her temple, one he had kissed countless times in the quiet of their marriage bed. It was Emily's face, alive, breathing, wet with tears. He swayed, gripping the edge of the headstone for balance, his mind racing for logic, for explanation, but none came. His pulse hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that drowned out everything else. The woman froze under his stare, her expression shifting from sorrow to confusion, then to something sharper, a recognition of his shock. Slowly, she rose to her feet, clutching a small purse against her side as though it might shield her. The breeze pulled at her hair, revealing more of the face that should not exist, could not exist. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft yet steady, different from Emily's, but achingly familiar. "Am I intruding?" The sound of her words jolted him, snapping him into the present, but his body refused to obey. His lips moved before his mind caught up. "Who are you?" The woman hesitated, eyes flickering between him and the grave at her feet. Finally, she answered, her name carried across the cold autumn air like a whisper from another life. "Claire," she said quietly, "Claire Wilson." And in that moment, David Reynolds knew his life had just shifted into something he could not yet name, but would never escape. The chill of that afternoon followed David home. Though the cemetery gates had long closed behind him, he sat in his study, surrounded by walls of dark wood and shelves lined with accolades. From a lifetime at business awards, certificates, photographs with presidents and CEOs. They were supposed to mean something, symbols of power and achievement. Yet under the amber glow of his desk lamp they looked hollow. His hand still trembled faintly as he poured himself a glass of scotch. But he didn't drink it. The only image in his mind was the face of the woman in the cemetery, not Emily. He told himself that 100 times, but the denial never stuck. Not Emily. Yes, she had the same eyes, the same delicate birthmark, the same way her mouth trembled when emotion overtook her. If grief had been a fog before, it had now turned into a storm, roaring in his head with questions he couldn't silence. Who was Claire Wilson? Why had she been at that grave on that day, crying as if mourning someone close, only to turn her face and rip open the deepest wound he carried? David had spent years mastering the art of control. He built empires by seeing what others missed, by refusing to flinch when rivals blinked. But tonight, his control abandoned him. He paced the length of the study, the floor creaking beneath his steps. His mind replayed the scene again and again. Her glance up at him, startled yet unafraid, and that quiet confession of her name, Claire. He should have let her leave. He knew that. He should have returned to his car, driven home, buried himself in work. But instead, he had stopped her. His voice sharp with desperation he hadn't even recognized in himself. Wait. He had heard the urgency in his tone, like a drowning man calling out for air. As she had paused, they met again only minutes later at the small cafe just outside the cemetery gates. The place was nearly empty, the kind of spot where people went for solitude rather than company. He remembered the scrape of her chair against the floor as she sat across from him, her hands folded carefully on the table, her shoulders tense, as though she were bracing for interrogation. I didn't mean to startle you, David began, but his voice betrayed him, heavy and uneven. It's just, you look like her. Claire finished for him, not as a question but a fact. Her gaze was steady, but there was pain in it, as though she had seen the reaction before in other strangers' eyes. David nodded slowly, unable to speak. She was your wife, Claire continued, her voice softening. Emily Reynolds. She said the name as if tasting it, testing the weight of it on her tongue. He leaned forward, his hands tightening around the porcelain cup of coffee he hadn't touched. How do you know that? I saw the headstone, Claire admitted, and I saw your face when you looked at me. The air between them seemed to hum with an unspoken tension, a current of something neither dared to name. I was adopted, she added, almost abruptly, as though it might explain everything. I never knew my birth family, just a name on a file and a date on a birth certificate. That's all I've had my whole life. Adopted. The word seemed to reverberate in David's skull. Emily had been born in 1982 in Manhattan, Claire said. Her records were from Manhattan, the same year. Coincidence, or something far larger? David pulled his wallet from his jacket, sliding out a worn photograph of Emily on their last anniversary, her smile radiant as she leaned across a restaurant table. He pushed it toward Claire. She hesitated, then picked it up. The color drained from her face. Her hand trembled as she studied the image. This. Her voice broke slightly. This is impossible. David's pulse thundered in his ears. And yet here you are, he said quietly. Claire set the photograph down carefully, as though it were glass that might shatter. Her gaze lifted back to his, and in that moment, David saw it, the same spark, the same depth of thought that Emily's eyes had carried. It was not just resemblance, it was blood. A silence stretched between them, heavy with realization neither could deny. David's chest tightened, fear and hope warring inside him. If she was connected to Emily, if she was family, then why had Emily never spoken of her? Why had she lived and died without ever revealing this secret? I shouldn't be here, Claire whispered suddenly, pushing back her chair. Her voice wavered between fear and resolve. I don't know what this means, and I can't. David's hand shot out before he could think, his fingers closing lightly around her wrist. Please, he said, the single word raw, stripped of all his usual composure. Don't walk away. Not yet. She froze, her breath catching, then slowly sat back down. Her expression was guarded now, her walls raised, but her eyes betrayed the truth. She was just as unsettled, just as shaken as he was. You look exactly like her, David whispered, almost to himself. But you can't be her. So who are you? Claire Wilson. Who are you really? Claire lowered her gaze, her hands clasping tightly together as though she might steady herself with the pressure alone. I don't know, she admitted, but maybe it's time I found out. The cafe fell silent around them, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint scrape of a spoon against china, the only sounds in the dim light, And for the first time since Emily's death, David felt something stir in the hollow place inside him. It wasn't peace. Not yet. It wasn't even hope. It was something sharper. A question that burned it fiercely to ignore, and he knew with a certainty that frightened him, that he would stop at nothing until he uncovered the truth. The night after their meeting, David did not sleep. His penthouse windows framed the sleepless city, but for once he did not see it as a kingdom he controlled. The neon lights were distant, indifferent. He sat at his desk surrounded by silence, his phone cold in his hand, replaying every detail of that cafe conversation until his thoughts blurred. He had stared at hostile negotiators across polished boardroom tables, outmaneuvered rivals who would have gutted him without a second thought, but never not once had he been as unsettled as he was now. Claire's words clung to him. Adopted. No family. Born in Manhattan. 1982. Emily's year. Emily's hospital. Coincidence? That word felt laughable now, an insult to reason. He needed answers, not theories. And answers, he knew from decades of business, required digging where others refused to look. By dawn, he had already made the call. A private investigator he trusted with background checks on billion-dollar deals was now tasked with something far more personal. Find everything about Claire Wilson's adoption. Every record, every sealed file. The man warned him the request would be difficult. David only replied, "I don't care what it costs. Break the walls. Get it done." Hours crawled by. David drifted from room to room, restless. Every shadow felt alive with Emily's memory, the scarf draped over a chair. The photo albums he had never opened since her death. Her favorite mug still sitting in the kitchen cabinet as though she might walk in and claim it. He caught himself staring at his reflection in the window and hated what he saw. A powerful man undone by a stranger's face. The phone rang just after noon. David snatched it up so quickly he nearly dropped it. "I found something," the investigator said, his voice taut with caution. "It wasn't easy. The records were sealed. But I traced hospital files, birth logs, court proceedings." David's pulse slammed in his ears. "Tell me." The man took a breath, as though steadying himself. Claire Wilson was born in Manhattan General Hospital, April 1982. There were complications. Twins were delivered. The mother, Margaret Sinclair, died during childbirth. The word struck David like a physical blow. Twins. His grip tightened. On the phone. "Go on." The father, James Sinclair, suffered a breakdown, couldn't care for either infant. The maternal grandparents stepped in, but they were elderly, struggling financially. Social services intervened. They allowed the grandparents to keep one child, the healthier twin. The other was surrendered to the state. That infant became Claire Wilson. For a long moment, David could not speak. The world seemed to tilt beneath him. Emily had been one of two. She had lived her entire life never knowing her reflection walked the same earth, orphaned by the same tragedy. Or had she known? The thought sliced through him with sudden dread. "Does Claire know any of this?" he asked hoarsely. "No," the investigator said. "Not unless she uncovered the records herself. Everything was buried. But make no mistake, David, Claire Wilson is Emily Reynolds' twin sister." The line went silent. David stood in the center of his office, the city sprawling endlessly beyond his windows. And for the first time in his life, he felt powerless. By the time Claire arrived at his apartment later that day at his invitation, David was ready. He had laid out photo albums, letters, fragments of Emily's life he had avoided for a year. His hands trembled as he guided her in. When she stepped into the living room and her eyes landed on the photographs, it was like watching a mirror stumble into a hall of memories. She picked up a wedding photo. Her fingers traced the curve of Emily's face, identical to her own. She was beautiful. Claire whispered, "She was light." David said quietly, "That's the word I always come back to. She lit up rooms, lit up me." He swallowed. "And now I know why. She wasn't whole. She was carrying the absence of you. Somehow she knew." Claire turned to him, startled. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then told her everything: the phone call, the files, the truth he had clawed out of the shadows when he spoke the word twins. Claire's face drained of color, her knees buckled, and she sank onto the sofa as though the weight of it had collapsed her spine. "Twins," she whispered, staring at her hands. "I always felt wrong, like something was missing, like part of me wasn't there." And all this time, David sat across from her, unable to look away. "You weren't missing something, Claire. You were missing someone." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, her lips trembling. "Why didn't anyone tell me? Why didn't anyone?" "Because the world is cruel," David said, his voice sharper than he intended. "Because systems fail, because people hide what they can't face. But now we know, and we'll keep digging until every piece is laid bare." The silence between them was electric, heavy with both grief and revelation. Outside, the city roared with life, but in that apartment the people sat still, staring at truths that rewrote everything they thought they knew. Claire's voice broke the quiet. "Then I need to meet him." David frowned. "Who? Our father," she whispered. "If he's alive." The air in the room seemed to constrict. David had not dared think that far ahead, but he knew, with a certainty that left him unsettled, that the path they had just stepped onto would not stop until every ghost was unearthed. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the grief, beneath the fear, a dangerous spark began to kindle in David Reynolds' chest. The spark of hope. The request burned in David's mind long after Claire left his apartment that night. "I need to meet him." Her voice still echoed through the silent penthouse, fragile yet determined, as though she had been waiting her whole life for the chance to say it. For hours, David paced the marble floor like a man at war with himself. James Sinclair, a name from hospital files and court documents. A man who had shattered under tragedy and disappeared into the system just as his daughters had. Could he still be alive? Could he bear to face the daughter he lost? By dawn, David had the answer. The investigator's call came with grim precision. James Sinclair was alive, 80 years old, living in a nursing facility in New Jersey. Early onset Alzheimer's had stolen much of his clarity, but he was still there, still breathing, still holding the weight of choices and tragedies from decades ago. David drove in silence the following morning, his black sedan humming steadily. Along the highway, beside him, Claire sat rigid, her hands twisting a small silver locket she wore around her neck. She had said little since getting into the car. Her silence was louder than words, each twist of the locket a sign of the storm she held inside. "Are you afraid?" David asked softly, breaking the tension. Claire's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. "I've spent my whole life not knowing where I came from. Now that I'm about to find out, I feel like I can't breathe." Her fingers tightened around the locket. What if he doesn't remember me? What if he doesn't want to? David's grip tightened on the wheel. He wanted to tell her it didn't matter, that she had already found family in him, in Emily's memory, but the words caught in his throat. If he doesn't remember, it's not because he doesn't want to, it's because life was cruel to him. And if he does remember, then you'll finally have the truth you deserve. The nursing home was a plain building tucked among bare trees, its windows glowing with weak morning light. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and old books. A nurse led them down a long corridor, her voice hushed, her eyes darting curiously between Claire and David. She opened the door to a small private room and gestured them inside. James Sinclair sat by the window, his frame thin and stooped in a padded armchair. His hair was silver, his skin lined with years of grief and decline. He turned slowly as they entered, his eyes cloudy but not vacant. For a moment, he only studied them in silence. Then his lips parted and his voice rasped out like brittle paper. "Margaret?" Claire froze. The name struck her like lightning, her mother's name. The woman she had never known. "No," she whispered, stepping forward with trembling hands. "I'm not Margaret." James squinted, his face crumpling with confusion. Then, "Who?" He stopped, his breath catching. His gaze sharpened suddenly and his hand lifted, shaking as it reached toward her face. You look just like her." "No, not Margaret, Emily." The room tilted around David as the name hung in the air. He watched Claire kneel beside her father's chair, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I'm not Emily either. My name is Claire Wilson. I'm your daughter too." James's eyes widened, and for a fleeting moment clarity blazed in them, cutting through the haze of his illness. His hand trembled as it touched Claire's cheek, his breath shuddering. "Daughter," his voice cracked. "But they told me one of you died." Claire's tears spilled freely now. "I didn't die. I was given away. I grew up in foster care. I never knew." David stood back, his heart hammering. The pieces snapped into place in a way that left him reeling. The lies, the secrets, the broken family line, all of it had kept these people apart for decades. And yet here they were, father and daughter, touching for the first time after a lifetime of absence. James's chest heaved with the weight of memory, I came out of the hospital, and they said only Emily survived. I begged them, but they said I was too broken, too unfit. Margaret's parents, they hated me. They wanted me gone. They took Emily, and they buried you in my heart." Claire grasped his frail hand in both of hers, pressing it to her cheek. "I was alive all along. You didn't lose me. I was just lost." David swallowed hard, his throat dry, his eyes burning despite his efforts to hold composure. He felt like an intruder, yet he couldn't look away. He had come here for answers. But what he was witnessing was something beyond truth. It was the resurrection of a bond thought dead for 40 years. James's gaze shifted then, faltering, as it landed on David. "And you're not my blood. Who are you?" David stepped closer, his voice steady, but heavy with grief. "I'm David Reynolds. I was Emily's husband." The old man's face collapsed, his lips trembled, and his eyes filled with tears. "Emily," his voice broke on her name. "Gone?" David nodded once. "A year ago." James leaned back, in his chair, his face crumpling as though under unbearable weight. His frail body shook with sobs that clawed their way from the depths of him. "My Margaret, my Emily, and now, Claire, the one I thought I lost. Found only to know I've lost the other." Claire wrapped her arms around his fragile shoulders, her tears soaking into the fabric of his sweater. "You haven't lost me. I'm here now. I'm here. Dad." The word Dad seemed to breathe life back into him. He clutched her hand as though afraid she might vanish again. His lips trembled with something unsaid. "The locket," he whispered suddenly, his voice barely audible. Claire's breath hitched. "What?" "The locket," James repeated, his eyes sharp again. Did you get it?" Her hand flew to her neck. She pulled the chain free, the small silver pendant glinting in the morning light. "Yes, I've had it since I was 12. It came in the mail one day. No return address, just a note that said, 'You are loved.'" James closed his eyes, a faint smile curving his lips. "Emily," he murmured. "She found the adoption papers. She was just a child, but she found them. She came to me. She swore she'd find you. She sent you the locket, didn't she? Even then, she was looking for you." The silence in the room deepened, charged with revelation. David's stomach dropped, his pulse racing. Emily had known. She had carried the secret of her sister all along, a truth she had never shared even with him. Claire's voice was a broken whisper. She knew about me." James nodded weakly, his hand trembling against hers. "She never stopped searching. She never forgot you. She loved you before she even knew your name." The words fell like a hammer against David's chest. Emily had known. She had hidden this secret, not out of betrayal, but out of love. And in that moment, as he watched Claire's tears fall onto her father's hands, David realized he was standing in the middle of a story that began long before him one. He had only just been pulled into, and he knew, with an eerie certainty, that the revelations were far from over. Snow still lingered on the ground the morning after their visit to the nursing home. It clung to the edges of sidewalks, gray with city soot, melting slowly under the hesitant winter sun. David hadn't slept again. He sat in his car outside Claire's modest Brooklyn apartment, engine idling. The city's hum alive around him. When she appeared at the building's door, wrapped in a wool coat and scarf, he saw in her eyes the same storm that had been keeping him awake. The revelation that Emily had known, that she had searched, that she had reached across the years with a silver locket to connect them. Where first? Claire asked as she slid into the passenger seat, her breath puffing white in the cold. Her voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her, twisting the strap of her bag over and over. David didn't answer immediately. He was studying her face again, the uncanny likeness to Emily, the way grief and determination mingled in her eyes. Finally, he said, "We'll go where she began. The house in Queens." The drive was quiet, but not an empty quiet. It was the kind of silence charged with the unsaid. Claire stared out the window as buildings shifted from Manhattan glass to the older bricks of Queens. David's thoughts gnawed at him. Emily had carried a secret all their years together. She had known of her sister, and yet she had never breathed a word to him. Why? To protect Claire? To shield her grandparents' lie? Or was it because David himself had never made enough space for her to trust him with something so raw? The house stood on a quiet street lined with bare trees, a small, brick-faced home with iron railings now rusted with time. Another family lived there now, but to David it was Emily's house still. He parked at the curb, Claire stared at the building with an expression caught between longing and fear. "She grew up there?" she asked, her voice tight. David nodded. "Her grandparents raised her. They didn't have much, but they gave her stability. She used to tell me how she'd spend hours on the porch steps reading while her grandmother worked. In the kitchen, they stood together on the sidewalk, the weight of ghosts pressing down. For Claire, it was like peering through glass into a life that should have been hers. For David, it was seeing the roots of Emily's light and feeling the sting of all the moments he had never understood while she was alive. Their next stop was a Metropolitan Museum of Art, where Emily had worked in the restoration department. The museum loomed large, solemn, its steps busy with tourists. As they entered, a curator David knew did a double take when he saw Claire. His lips parted as if to speak Emily's name, but David interjected gently, "This is Claire, Emily's sister." The word sister felt strange in his mouth, yet right. Claire moved through the gallery with reverence, her eyes catching on the paintings Emily had once tended. She lingered longest in the European wing, tracing the brushstrokes of a canvas restored under Emily's care. Her voice was hushed when she spoke. "She touched this. She gave it new life." "She always said her work wasn't about art," David replied. Watching her, it was about memory, preserving what time tried to erase. The word struck them both with sudden weight. Claire's lips trembled, and she looked away, blinking quickly. From there, David led her to a small cafe tucked near the museum. Emily had loved the place. The owner, a weary Italian man with warm eyes, froze when Claire entered. His hand trembled as he set down a tray. "Madonna mia," he whispered. "Emily?" David shook his head softly. "Her sister." The man's eyes misted. "She used to sit there," he said, pointing to a corner table. "Always with her sketchbook, always smiling. She gave this place more warmth than all the candles we lit." Claire's hand brushed over the worn wood of the table, as though hoping to feel some trace of Emily's presence left behind. Her breast shuddered. "Everywhere we go, she's here, and yet she's gone." Their last stop of the day was the homeless shelter in Lower Manhattan. The building was modest, unassuming, its brick faded by weather and time. Inside, the air smelled faintly of soup and laundry soap. Volunteers bustled in the kitchen. Children laughed in a corner. When David and Claire introduced themselves, a woman named Sophia, middle-aged and strong-eyed, embraced David before turning to Claire and gasping, "Emily," she breathed. "Claire." David corrected again, his voice firm but gentle. "Her sister. We only just found each other." Sophia pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes filling. "It explains everything," she whispered. "Emily always said she felt like something was missing, like part of her was out there, waiting." She poured herself into the children here, into the broken people, as if she was trying to fill a hole inside herself. Claire's hands shook as she touched the mural painted along the shelter's hallway, a burst of colors Emily had helped the children create. "She was searching for me," she whispered. "She was searching for connection," Sophia said softly. "She gave everyone who walked through these doors a piece of it, and now you're here. Maybe you're the piece she was missing." As they left the shelter that evening, night had fallen and the city glowed with neon and headlights. They walked side by side, but David could feel the shift. Claire was no longer just a stranger with Emily's face. She was becoming something else, an anchor, a mirror, a question he was both terrified and desperate to answer. "Thank you," she said quietly, pausing at the subway entrance, "for showing me her world, for letting me know her." David looked at her, the cold air frosting between them. "You don't have to thank me. I need this too. Maybe more than you know." She hesitated, her eyes searching his. "Tomorrow," she said. "We keep going tomorrow." As she disappeared down the subway steps, David stood rooted, the sound of the city swirling around him. For the first time since Emily's death, he felt a strange pulse in his chest. Not relief, not joy, something sharper, something dangerous, purpose. Snow drifted across the George Washington Bridge the night David drove back from the shelter. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel, but his thoughts were far from the road. Emily's laughter, Claire's trembling hands on that mural. James's fragile eyes haunted him all at once, for the first time since Emily's funeral. David didn't feel like a man trapped in grief. He felt like a man standing on the edge of something he couldn't name, terrified. Yes, but alive. The call came at dawn. "Mr. Reynolds?" It was the nurse from Pine Grove. Her voice carried a soft urgency. "It's about James Sinclair. You should come, both of you. He's taken a turn." The words echoed in his ears long after the line went dead. Within the hour, he was outside Claire's apartment, leaning on his horn. She came running down the steps, her coat half-zipped. Fear etched into her features. No words were needed. She knew. The drive to New Jersey was heavy with silence. Claire sat stiff beside him, her locket turning endlessly between her fingers like a talisman. Finally, she whispered, "I just found him. I can't lose him now. Not yet." David risked a glance at her, the pain in her voice twisting like a knife inside him. He wanted to promise. She wouldn't lose her father, but he had buried Emily he knew better than to make promises against. Death. All he could offer was presence. When they entered the nursing home, the hall seemed quieter than usual, as though the building itself was holding its breath. James lay frail against the sheets, his chest rising in shallow, uneven pulls. His eyes fluttered open when Claire sat beside him, her hands clutching his with desperate strength. "Dad," she whispered, tears trembling on her lashes. "I'm here." The old man's gaze flickered, clouded and lost at first, then sharpening with a sudden burst of recognition. A slow smile crept across his lips. "My Margaret's girl," he breathed. Then his gaze slid toward David, and his voice cracked. "And Emily's man." David stiffened, caught off guard by the clarity of the words. He stepped closer, nodded once. James's hand twitched weakly in Claire's. "Listen," he rasped, his voice frail, but urgent. "Emily, she made me promise." Claire leaned in so close her tears dotted his blanket. "Promise what?" "Dad." His eyes glistened, lucid now in a way David had never seen before. "She told me if anything ever happened to her I had to make sure you'd have found each other. That was her wish, said you need one another someday." His gaze shifted between them, fierce and unyielding despite the weakness of his body. She was right. The room tilted. David's chest tightened painfully. Emily had known. She hadn't just discovered Claire when she was 12. She had anticipated this moment. Years before her death, she had seen the shape of her absence and planned for it. Claire clutched his hand harder. "She wanted us to meet." James nodded, his breath ragged. "She said love doesn't die. It just changes. She wanted you both to carry her light together." The weight of those words settled like thunder in David's soul. He staggered back a step, gripping the edge of the chair to steady himself. All those nights, he had cursed her silence, wondered why she never told him about Claire, and here was the answer. Emily had been waiting for the day when her sister and her husband would be left standing alone in the world, and would need each other to go on. James's body trembled, exhaustion pulling him back under, his breath slowing. Claire pressed her forehead against his hand, sobbing quietly. David stood helpless, a man who had once wielded power like a weapon, now unable to stop the inevitable. They stayed the night in a hotel near the facility. Neither spoke much, but when Claire broke down in the quiet of the lobby, David wrapped his arm around her. She leaned into him, shaking, and he realized with something like fear how much he needed the contact too. James died 3 days later. The staff said it was peaceful, one of those rare gifts where clarity returned in the final hours. He had called Claire his daughter, told her he loved her, told David to take care of her. Then he was gone. The funeral was small, the winter sun pale over the cemetery, a few relatives, some of the nursing staff, and Claire and David standing side by side, bound by grief that felt both old and new. When the last shovel of dirt fell, Claire whispered, "I can't do this again." David's voice was steady, though his heart was breaking. "You don't have to. You're not alone anymore." It was in the days that followed that purpose began to take shape. They were going through Emily's old boxes together when Claire pulled out a folder of sketches Emily had made for art classes she ran at the shelter. There were notes scrawled in the margins about expanding programs, about creating a permanent space. She wanted this, Claire said, her eyes wet but burning with conviction, not just a few classes. She wanted something lasting. David stared at the plans. For years, he had dismissed Emily's charity work as a distraction, something beneath the priorities of his empire. But now, the sketches felt like a map, her way of pointing them forward. "We'll build it," he said suddenly. Claire looked up, startled. "What? A place? A center?" Her vision, not mine. "The Emily Sinclair Arts Center. We'll give her what she dreamed." The words spilled out with a finality that surprised even him. But the moment they were spoken, he felt it, the hollow place inside him beginning to fill. Not with Emily's absence, but with her legacy. And as Claire smiled through her tears, he realized something else. For weeks he had seen Emily's face when he looked at her, but now, for the first time, he saw only Claire, her strength, her fire, her own light. It terrified him, because love was stirring again, uninvited, unexpected, and he had no idea if embracing it would honor Emily or betray her. The winter had hardened into February by the time the Emily Sinclair Art Center opened its doors. Snow lined the sidewalks, turned to gray slush by the footsteps of a city too restless to pause. But the building itself glowed warm against the night. Light spilled from its tall windows onto the street, golden and inviting, as though Emily's spirit had finally been given walls and a roof. Inside, the place thronged with life. Paintings lined the walls, pieces from shelter residents, local children, even established New York artists who had donated work in Emily's honor. The classrooms buzzed with laughter and chatter, pencils scratching across paper, brushes swiping, bold color on oak canvas, and in the gallery at the center of it all stood David Reynolds, the man who once dismissed charity as weakness. Now watching his late wife's vision come alive before his eyes, he should have felt triumphant. He should have felt at peace. Instead, his heart beat with a storm he couldn't calm. Because across the room stood Claire Wilson, Emily's twin. Her face so familiar, and yet her presence so uniquely hers that David no longer knew where his grief ended and something else began. She was laughing with a group of photographers, her dark hair swept elegantly back, her eyes shining not with sorrow, but with purpose. He had watched her transform in these last weeks from a woman mourning a family she never knew into a force of will, carrying Emily's torch forward. And David couldn't stop asking himself the question that gnawed at him. If Emily had wanted them to meet, if she had wanted them to find each other, then what did that mean? Was this whatever this was between them a betrayal? Or was it destiny? The speeches began. Claire stepped onto the small stage, her presence commanding though. Her voice trembled at first. "This center is not just about art," she said, her gaze sweeping the crowded room. "It's about connection. My sister Emily believed in seeing people not for what they lacked, but for what they carried inside them. She believed beauty could rise out of pain, that belonging could grow where loneliness once lived. Tonight, this place stands as proof that her belief was not in vain." The audience erupted in applause, many with tears shining in their eyes. David's throat tightened as he watched her. She wasn't just speaking Emily's words, she was speaking her own. She was no longer living in Emily's shadow. She was stepping into her own light. After the crowd dispersed, after the last guest trickled into the snowy night, David and Claire lingered in the quiet gallery. They stood shoulder to shoulder before a mural painted by children from the shelter, bright colors exploding across the wall, chaos shaped into something beautiful. Snowflakes drifted against the window panes, soft and silent. Emily would be proud. Claire whispered she would. David agreed. He hesitated, then added softly, "But she'd be prouder of you." Claire turned, startled. "Of me?" "Yes," he said, "because she always carried the ache of not knowing you, and now, you're here. You've turned her unfinished dream into something alive. You've given her more than I ever did." Her eyes glistened, her breath catching. "Don't say that. She loved you." David's voice broke, "and I failed her more times than I can count." Silence pressed between them, thick with grief and unspoken desire. Claire reached out then, not with hesitation, but with quiet certainty, and took his hand. Her fingers were warm against his, grounding him. It was then that the director of the shelter hurried in, clutching an envelope. "Mr. Reynolds," she said breathlessly. "This was found in James Sinclair's belongings after he passed. It has your name on it." David frowned, taking the envelope with careful hands. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting achingly familiar. Emily's. His vision blurred as he unfolded the letter. Claire stood close beside him, reading over his shoulder. "David," it began, "if you're reading this, I am gone. Please don't close your heart. Please don't hide from the world. There's someone you must meet. Her name is Claire. She is my other half, the piece of me I never had. You will know her when you see her. I don't know how, but I trust you will. And when you do, don't turn away. Love her, not because she looks like me, but because she is hers. She will give you back what I cannot. Life." David's hands trembled, the words swimming as tears blurred his vision. He pressed the letter to his chest, unable to breathe, unable to move. Emily had known. She had seen all of this long before it came to pass. Claire's face was pale, Her lips parted in shock. She wanted us to find each other. Yes, David whispered, his voice raw. She wanted this. She wanted you. He turned to her, his grief colliding with something deeper, something fiercer. As she wanted me not to let you go, Claire's tears spilled, her shoulders shaking as he pulled her into his arms. For a moment they stood together in the empty gallery, the world outside silent, but for the whisper of snow. It wasn't a replacement for Emily, it never could be. But in that moment, David understood what she had meant in the letter. Love wasn't finite. It could grow, expand, change, and as Claire's head rested against his chest, he felt for the first time not the weight of loss, but the fragile, trembling spark of life returning. They stepped outside together into the falling snow, locking the doors of the center behind them. The building glowed warmly against the dark night, a beacon on the street. David tightened his grip on Claire's hand, his voice quiet but certain. We honor her by moving forward. Together, Claire's fingers tightened around his. I think she knew we'd need each other all along, and as the snow fell around them, David finally allowed himself to believe that Emily's love hadn't ended in death. It had simply changed shape, guiding them both into a future they had never imagined, but one she had quietly prepared for all along.